This is Security Download, your ultimate source for the latest developments in private security. Host Anna Redmond will bring you the inside scoop, groundbreaking trends, and exclusive interviews with leading experts in both residential and business security. Security Download is powered by Brav, delivering tech-forward, customer service-focused private security.
Hello, I am so excited for our guest today. He brings so many different perspectives to this conversation. Not only did he graduate top 10% of his class from West Point, he also specializes in all aspects of commercial real estate. He's the managing partner at Dinosaur Capital Partners, has over 25 years of commercial real estate experience. I am so excited to welcome Mark Dufton.
Thanks, Anna. Good afternoon, or good morning to you.
Morning to me, afternoon to you. Who knows when our viewers are watching or listening to this. Good day. Also, We'll start off that way. So Mark, tell me, when you think security and real estate, what's the first thing you do out of the gate?
Sure. I think the most important thing, and we've done quite a bit of development over the last 14 years at Dinosaur Capital Partners, a lot of that related to multifamily projects. And I think there's been a distinct lack of planning, advanced planning in commercial real estate development. And I mean starting, with the architecture. In fact, even I wanted to note that I think there should be some sort of independent security consultant involved in this process, as opposed to a lot of times it's just an electrical engineer or who's got some knowledge of security systems, or in some cases, it's even a vendor who comes in and just designs a system on behalf of the owner. So I think that's a little breakdown in the system from the start, not having some professional help involved. But then once you get into the design, really looking at aspects that can help improve your security instead of making it an afterthought. And I think I gave an example about we designed this apartment building with 70 units, and it had street level parking, but the apartments were actually over some of that parking. And we ended up, it was adjacent to a public park that we had redesigned the park. So there's a lot of traffic there. And it ended up being this very dark corner because we had a fence that separated the park, a high fence that separated the park from the parking lot. Ended up being a really dark corner, and of course became a haven for crime, vandalism, theft, and it's just been constant for us in the last couple of years trying to manage that. And the amount of time we've dealt with that issue when we could have probably thought about that.
Sure. Out of the gate, just change the design.
Just out of the gate. And there's so many examples of that we see in architecture and planning about, segregating public spaces from private spaces and how that's done.
Let me ask you a question on that. If I could just jump in for a second. So the example you just gave, what's so interesting to me about that is, when you describe it, it's so obvious. I'm like, oh, duh. If there's a dark segregated space, like, of course, if someone were to come in and like smoke or kids were to mess around, that's where they would do it. Is it always obvious, or have you had any surprises?
No, it's not. You just don't know. You see something, you see design on paper, and then when it's actually built, it feels different. It feels different. The lighting might not be what you anticipated, or how it interfaces with the abutting properties. That there's so many factors that you just can't anticipate until the thing is built. And I think, if we had brought in some type of real professional security consultant in advance, that you wouldn't have as many issues going forward in your property management.
That makes sense. Yeah. And
it costs you time and money. It costs you time and money, really, going forward.
For sure. And I think what we hear a lot of is, if you bring in someone who's focused on selling you a particular service, you may not necessarily be getting the level of consulting that you need. Um,
I can assure you of that. You're not. You're getting a system that they want to sell to you typically.
yeah.
So I
And
think
that really,
there's a flaw. There's, I think, a fundamental flaw in
Mhm.
the architecture, design, and planning of some of these projects.
So one thing you said that was super interesting to me when we chatted is you threw out this nugget of wisdom. You were like, you want to make sure that all of the entrances are sort of in the same space so you don't have people wandering around a building.
Right.
Can you elaborate a little more on that and kind of give us some background on how to achieve that?
Sure. Yeah, the just trying to limit your public access spaces to the most prominent part of the building where you can control it, and it's segregated from the private entrances, the various private entrances you might have, whether it's office or multifamily or whatever the type of commercial property. So really having that is designed and so you can control the access. I mean, as a commercial property owner, access is probably your number one concern, right?
Mm-hmm.
About who's getting into your property and where are they going. So having that element of design incorporated up front to keep, if there is some public meeting that's being held in your apartment building, limiting that access to something that's really an area that's really controllable.
That makes a lot of sense. So access is number one. What would you say would be the number 2, 3, and 4 things that you tend to see people thinking about a lot in terms of maintaining security?
Sure. I mean, do you have the right technology? Is a good one too. I mean, I think commercial real estate's a $20+ trillion market, and I think that the level of technology is pretty low for a sector of that size.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically within that sector, I think that security has taken a back seat in a lot of cases. So you're concerned about your technology, your access. What are the threats? You have so many things, potential threats from inside and outside, right? It's not just somebody coming in and stealing or causing damage. It's somebody inside. It might be actually there's cybersecurity issues, right? There's access to your money. Your property manager has access to your bank account in a lot of cases. So there's just a number of things you have to think about, but I'd say primarily access, technology, and staffing. Do you have the right staff? Are they trained? Are they trustworthy? Can you rely on them to represent your property and have a high level of integrity?
Yeah. And is that staff like the property managers or staff like security staff that are hired, or both?
Yeah, both. I mean, clearly, in a lot of cases, I mean, you find obviously in big malls and offices, which are probably, two of the bigger users of sort of outside security, if you will. And just a note on that, a side note on that, those are two industries which are really, really struggling right now. Mall properties, office properties. Mall properties are going to be reduced from probably 1,200, 1,300 nationwide to, probably 700 properties when all this shakes out. In office, obviously, well documented what's happening there post COVID. You're seeing a lot of tenants not renewing. So, controlling, and they're probably the two biggest users of visible security, Anna, if you will, right? So you go to a mall, you see security guards walking around. I was in a big mall yesterday in Boston. There was, I don't know, eight or 10 security guards probably.
That's a lot. Wow.
Between they had there's two sections of the mall, and it's probably a couple million square feet. But and then you go to an office building, right? And you go to a large office building in any major city, right? You have 4 security people sitting at the desk. And so That being said, those industries are struggling. They're trying to find ways to, although they they pass along these costs to the tenant, obviously, but just because it's passed along to a tenant, again, tenants are becoming much more cost conscious, and therefore the owners must be too. So is the right, just picture going into an office building, right? In the last 10 years, you go in, typically, you're in New York City, you wait in a line that's 10 people deep to get into the building. Is that the best use of guard resources, to just, 99.9% of those people coming into the building aren't necessarily, threats at all. So the amount of time, it's kind of like sitting in traffic on a daily basis, right? You have people coming in, you're spending money on guard time. They're just doing basically administrative stuff effectively. Is that the right model? Is there some other technology that can make that more efficient?
So I love that you brought that up because, I think as I shared with you when we were prepping for this, so much of our audience is both providers of security services, but also hirers of security services, whether they're property managers or heads of HR of large companies. And this is gold for me to kind of probe into. Where do you see the opportunity? Is it removing the person from the security guard from that interaction? Is it changing the level of scrutiny? What have you seen that's been like a breath of fresh air that's worked really well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a combination of things. I think the security industry itself, as it relates to commercial real estate, is sort of at odds with what's happening in commercial real estate, because commercial real estate is seeing definitely higher security needs, not necessarily just, it's not a matter of just crime across the board, because that's not necessarily happening everywhere, but specific crimes that we talked about the other day, workplace violence, and how you have a couple million cases of that a year. We talked about theft, and specifically retail theft, and shrink, and how that's affecting both security and the industry itself. So I think.
And can I just, obviously you and I had this great conversation before we started recording. The listeners didn't get the privilege of hearing us chatting then. Yeah. Can you recap quickly the kind of pressing concerns on workplace violence as well as retail theft?
Yeah, I mean, workplace violence, again, it's a couple million incidents per year now at this point.
It's crazy. It's so much.
Yeah, it's crazy. And a lot of the deaths from that are related to robberies. Yeah. Whether it's outside or inside the building. So, preventative measures. And again, in conjunction with police forces, which in some cases aren't as robust as they used to be, or can't respond as quickly. They're shrinking. Yeah. Right. It's an issue that property owners have to address. So I think there's got to be a combination of efficiency of use of personnel and additional technology that's brought to bear. I mean, I talked about the example of going into an office building and sitting there waiting. There's nothing more frustrating and probably a complete waste of time. And it's done all over the country, right? There's got to be a better. And I know you're a big AI fan, right? There's got to be a better system to control access that is not as time consuming and personnel intensive. And I'm not smart enough to know what that is, but it's got to take place. It's just a waste of resources, and the resources are, as I mentioned, for office especially, are much more scarce now. So they really have to. Really going to have to pay attention to that. And, we've seen some better access systems and security systems in some of the buildings we've gone to, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's anything that's, changing the world or disrupting the whole industry. And, like I said, you have increasing security needs for commercial properties, but you have a security industry that's relatively mature.
Yep.
Both the personnel and technology, right? It's relatively mature. I don't think it has a particularly good reputation among commercial property owners.
No, not at all. And
Yeah.
in fact, I wanted to dive in on that a little bit.
Yeah.
It's a problem. It's a big
Right.
problem. And I've heard, this one property manager I chatted with offline sort of throughout this quote, which was basically like, I've never worked with a security company I've liked. And I
Right.
heard that, I was like, wow, that's serious. So tell us some of the things that really don't work. And then I also would love to hear, what are the things that have stood out as being positives?
Well, you want your property managers and your outside security folks to be sort of the first line of defense and keep stuff away from your property before it happens. But the folks in that industry, there's this exceptionally high turnover. There is relatively low pay, and so those worlds collide, right? Because you want somebody who's very professional, highly trained, but yet the industry can't invest in that level of training when they're churning and burning folks. So, and I think that there has to be maybe the solution. The solution is, not just because they're not police officers in these cases, and
legally very limited.
Right. And I think so. I think there's some ill-defined roles too that can be better clarified. And maybe there's some other. Do you think
there are misunderstandings? Like, is there a mismatch of expectations where a property manager may want basically the equivalent of a private police force, but isn't getting it? Or do you feel like people are realistic about what the law says, as well as what makes sense for their properties?
Well, I think they're fairly realistic, but I think the frustration is that the level of turnover that you get, and sometimes the quality that you get in the efficiency, productivity, and maybe there's a way. Again, maybe if you're taking out some of the inefficiencies in the operations of the security, vis-a-vis the lines and the access control and some of the gate control and some of the other stuff. Maybe if that's improved, there's ways you can integrate security personnel into other property management functions, and it becomes more cost effective and efficient.
So that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about integrate them into other functions.
Right. So, I mean, in a large apartment building, right, you'll have a concierge in a couple hundred unit apartment, maybe in some more exclusive areas, smaller buildings, but in larger buildings you have a concierge who is presumably a fully trained security professional first and foremost, right? But the reality of it is they do a bunch of other stuff there, so that becomes more cost effective in that situation versus at an office building where you just have half a dozen folks lined up checking licenses and putting it into the computer all day long.
What's the bunch of other stuff that they do? What are some of the things on that list?
So I lived in a building that had this, and they would help any of the tenants with within limits, obviously, but they helped with some repair stuff. They were they were sort of jack of all trades. They really did a good job, and it felt like you got your money's worth. And they were more highly paid. They weren't paid. They weren't paid what a typical security guard might get paid. So maybe you just have to shift away from that model that exists in some of these commercial properties, and it's just been that way for so long. Anna, I think it's become sort of accepted practice, but not good practice.
Yeah. No, that's super interesting. And one thing that I've been really passionate about exploring is, what does customer service mean when it comes to the security space?
Yeah.
Is it just looking professional and smiling and saying hi? Is it, playing half of a concierge? Does that change from property to
Right.
property?
Right.
And it's so interesting to hear you say that. And so for this security team that was going so far as to help with repairs, did they just sort of expand their own job description, or was that explicit from the outset?
I'm not sure,
Yeah.
honestly, because I was a tenant in the
You were a
building
tenant. You weren't hiring
as
them.
opposed to, I mean, I was an owner, but of
Yep.
one of the properties, but wasn't making that decision. But it was really interesting. They were incredible people and
Mhm.
darn good representatives of the property management firm. I mean, they were real professionals, and they were paid as such.
Mhm.
And it was fun. It was fun to see and to be part of. But the other end of the spectrum, I think,
Mhm.
is very frustrating right now for property owners.
Yeah. So tell me about, if you have some stories, tell me about some things that you've seen that really have not worked security wise.
Yeah, I think that a lot of I think especially in the area of cameras,
Hmm.
and how while the technology is significantly better
Hmm.
than it's ever been, it's still not. I wouldn't say it's state of the art. Um, and I think I think there's a long way to go in that area. Again, potentially, partnered with some AI interface, and but there's a fine line too between security and surveillance, right? And
Totally. Totally.
how do you how do you balance people's rights? And so that's a touchy subject for a lot of folks, including property owners. They don't want to um, they don't want to be viewed as spying on every single movement. But the
And have you
reality of
had that complaint, by the way, at your properties where people
we,
felt there was too much surveillance, where it was oppressive?
no, we have not. I've heard of it in other
Yeah.
places, but we have not. And I think it's an excellent deterrent.
Hmm.
But the technologies still aren't great. I mean, you still, you can go into. I was telling this story. I was down in Florida. My brother-in-law was sick. I was going to the hospital. We were
Hmm.
going every day. He was in there for months and months. We were going in every single day, and every day we'd walk in and there'd be a line of 30 people at the door and three guards.
So
Again,
frustrating.
all doing the same thing, right?
Yep.
Taking. And I finally said, and I'm pretty patient.
Hmm.
I don't get upset over that. But around, like the third week that we were there
Uh-huh.
every day, and I knew the guy's name, and we were, bringing him coffee.
Uh-huh.
But it was just like, why do you? I said, why? First of all, you're taking this grainy photo of me that didn't, comes out on a sticker that doesn't mean anything.
Mhm.
Nobody's going to
Mhm.
match that
Mhm.
up to anything.
Mhm.
But why do I have to get a badge every single day? I mean,
Mhm.
there's the systems, even down to um, guards at subdivisions, right? That
Mhm.
you go online, you have an app, you go online, you can put in access for people,
Mhm.
you can give them certain amount of days or time, and I mean, there's these slick systems for access that and they're so infrequently used. I mean,
Yeah.
it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So
So to recap that, it sounds like there are a lot of systems being implemented in security that at some point the costs of it start outweighing the benefits, and there's no one really at the wheel
right,
to kind of identify that turning point.
right.
Um, and
Yeah, I
weigh.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, property managers and commercial property owners, have a lot of other things on
Mhm.
their priority list right now. It's hard to, as we talked about, it's hard to, while there's many benefits we can talk about to
Mhm.
security.
Mhm.
They're obvious, so I think we'll get into those. But how do you quantify that return on investment, and how do you really manage the efficiency of that as best as possible. That's just not
That's a
something
huge question. That's a
it's not
massive
something that's
question.
high on their list. Unfortunately, it's not now, maybe in a very early post 9/11 environment, there was a lot of
Yeah.
sensitivity to
Yeah.
terrorism and other sort of threats. But I think as time goes by, that sort of
Mhm.
it ebbs, and people's attention spans aren't as long on security matters, and that's when things start to happen, unfortunately.
Mhm.
But in an inflationary environment, as we talked about,
Mhm.
again, you have to have utilities, right? You have to keep the
Yep.
lights on, you have to
Yep.
heat, you have to have insurance,
Mhm.
but you can scale back on security, right? And just
Yeah.
hope something doesn't happen. But right.
Yep.
So it becomes semi-discretionary
Mhm.
in a lot of cases. And if you're not, especially in an apartment building or something, if you're not in a position to charge it to the tenants, you're bearing that cost. You
Mhm.
look at that. Unfortunately, you look at it's not right by any stretch of the imagination,
Mhm.
but that's that's reality. You look at that and start saying, how can I cut back? Or, it's easier to cut back than to make it more efficient,
Yep.
unfortunately. And that's instead of paying attention to it, looking out ahead, saying, hey, what can I do long term to make this a lower cost item, yet still provide the amount of
Mhm.
security that I'm comfortable with.
Mhm. That makes a lot of sense. And so, piggybacking off of that, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, you know, your property manager, you need security, whether it's because your tenants have requested it or it's somewhere in the mandate of the building. How do you go about evaluating the right security force?
Yeah. So if we've done it, I've done it a number of times over the years, and I think the process, but at least my process has evolved. Um, I ran a company for many years, which dealt with retail properties that were
Mhm.
closing,
Mhm.
stores that were closing or were vacant.
Mhm.
So,
It's a high security need.
right, it was a high security
Yeah.
need. But what we did with clients, and I think people should do this with security firms too, is
Mhm.
instead of having some clunky RFP process
Mhm.
that's pulled out of the drawer and said, hey, what are your qualifications? How's your training? And everybody's going to say, hey, we're great, we're the best, we're number one, right?
Mhm.
Um, what we did when we were trying to find clients in the real estate side is I would say to them, hey, give me a list of your properties, right?
Mhm.
I forget about the RFP and there's just give me a list of your properties, and I'm going to tell you exactly for each one of those properties what our assessment of it is. Not on a security basis, just on a real estate basis,
Mm,
but it applies the same way to security.
absolutely.
I'm going to tell you exactly more than you know about that property right now. So we would do that. They'd send over, and I had a guy who was a mall consultant, a guy who specialized in grocery anchored properties. So we would dive in and spend 2 days and make copious notes about, this is happening in the neighborhood. These are the rents. Here's who's coming. Here's who's going.
Wow.
So I showed them, I said, hey, I want to prove to you that I add value. And I think you do the same with a security consultant. Prove to
Totally.
me. I said, I'm going to give you, I think each property should have done some form of security assessment, right? Even if it's semi-formal,
Mhm.
do the security assessment, say, hey, where are we vulnerable? What are our issues? And you as the owner or property manager, you're going to know better than the security firm who's coming in day one, right? So give them a head start, say, hey, here's our plan, but you tell us, you come back and tell us, spend some time and tell us what we're doing wrong, what we could do better, or how we could be more efficient, as opposed to just, like I said, the rote answers. And it means nothing, right? I want to prove that they want to, they're willing to do some homework on
Mhm.
it, and they're willing to invest some time. and then talk to the people who are actually managing the account, right? Sometimes you get a salesperson and, blah, blah, blah. You get the, hey, this is fantastic. And, we've all done it, but, talk to who's managing the account and how they're managing their, obviously down to how they're managing their people and what the culturally, so many times it's just culturally not a good fit. And
tell me more about that. How so?
Well, I think I mentioned this to you the other day. I think that the safest choice is to pick a firm that is established, right? Especially if you're in a larger company, you're going to pick XYZ. I won't name any names, but we know the big players in the industry, who they are.
Totally.
You pick it. Nobody's going to second guess you, right? But it may not be that just may not be right for you. Their area of expertise may not be right. They may be too big, too small, whatever. They might not have people that match up, people that they put on site that match up with your how you'd like the building operated and how you want to interface with your customers. Because it is, as you mentioned, Anna, it's not just, you're not just providing security. You're a liaison, and you are, representing that building and the tenants in that building. So, I mean, it's really important that you get down to sort of the cultural level and how that is imbued into the organization. And again, I mentioned that, I have a particular penchant for military people,
Yeah.
as be it having a military background. I think there's some,
Sure.
I think there's some discipline there, and that serves well in that world. And I know a lot of the firms do hire or try to hire veterans, but it doesn't mean you can't find quality people. But it's tougher. I mean, it's a tougher environment to find people, especially at the pay levels of some of these security firms. I own a couple of retail stores, actually, my wife and I, and finding.
What kind of retail stores? I'm curious.
So I own a Life is Good branded products. It's a company based here out of Boston.
Okay, yeah, I feel like I've seen it. It's like baseball caps and
it's t-shirts and baseball caps. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Sort of feel good stuff. It's a beach town, and so it's a good vibe. And my wife owns a little women's boutique for home stuff and jewelry and clothing and
how fun.
And so the hiring environment has changed, dramatically in the last 3 years. I was telling the folks here at Ringmaster World headquarters here, which is a beautiful, beautiful place. I was telling them that, when I started that business, I started right during COVID, actually, which was ill-advised, but
that's exactly when you want people going into stores.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But I bet you got great rent, right?
Well, we own the building, so it was fine,
there you go. So then that makes sense.
It was an interesting time to start, but finding people to work has been a challenge. I mean, we started out at we're paying people $14 an hour. And now, 3 years later, we're paying $20 an hour to get the same.
And that's par for the course in cities across the US. Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting. I have heard, I think one of the, obviously this is something, this podcast is close to my heart because it's so tied into the business that Brav works on. But something that we hear consistently is that, at least within security, people really struggle to differentiate, and they don't always know the difference between the person making $20 and the person making, 26, right? And maybe sometimes there's no difference because they've hired inadequately. And maybe sometimes there's a difference and it's not visible because there's just very little transparency in the quality of the service that they're receiving, and sometimes little clarity about, what they expect. And that's a challenge. And so it's so interesting for me to hear you tackle this question head on, because it is a really big question.
Sure.
On one end, you want this amazing, very well-trained operative, and that's what everyone wants. And on the other hand, the ideal is, people come in and they're like, I want to pay minimum wage. And those two don't really go hand in hand.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so,
no, it's a fundamental question
yeah,
for commercial owners and security companies. And it just has to be addressed, because those worlds aren't converging very very well right now, as evidenced by the feedback that you get from owners and property managers and
totally. And so the thing I'm interested to ask you is, when have you seen security companies really knock it out of the park? Like, do you have some examples where you were like, man, if everyone did this thing, people would be willing to pay more?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it comes in, emergency situations, unfortunately, and frankly,
Yeah. Yeah.
is you see their sort of true metal, right? We years ago, I worked as a property manager for a large bank in Chicago, and we had it was in the early 90s. They were doing some construction in the Chicago River, and there was a pile. They were driving piles into the riverbed, and in the early 1900s, the buildings were fueled with coal, so there were coal tunnels that connected the river to a number of these high-rise buildings, and we were the property managers for about 10 million square feet of property downtown. So what happened was that when they drilled a hole or pounded a hole through the river, the river went into the hole and filled up all these coal tunnels. So subsequently,
Oh my gosh.
it filled the basements of these high rises. And in some cases, it rose to like 40, 50 feet, because it reached equilibrium with the river.
That's
And
appalling.
so all of the HVAC, the
Yeah.
electrical,
Yeah.
all this stuff was down in the basement, and it just, was underwater completely. So it was, and you couldn't just pump it out, because if you pumped it out, it came back to the same place, right? It would. So, we had the access to the buildings was a complete disaster, because the buildings had no electricity, they had no air conditioning. They had water in, some cases 40, 50 feet in the basement, the three basement levels. And, you literally had fish swimming in your basement. So we had a lot of security that we brought in at that point, because it was a massive, as you can imagine, a massive cleanup operation, to try to, and from an environmental perspective, you had to redo all of the electrical panels, the electrical systems in these buildings. It was, months and months of cleanup. And we had a security firm, and every vendor, we had all new vendors coming in. It was crazy access to these buildings, and trying to control that was a nightmare. And we had a security team that stepped up and were, just amazing in terms of their communication and dealing with vendors and trying to control that access without being, it's tough. It's tough for these security folks, because again, they're not police officers.
Yep.
So they have a limited amount of, or a limited ability to, convince people or coerce people.
Sure. Yeah.
To
That they overstep, they're
try to
getting
do the right
sued.
thing,
So
right?
there's definitely a line there. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a line, and these folks just did it right. They controlled it. We didn't have any issues, but it was a major task. So I think a lot of that, there's a lot of the sort of intangible things, or the cultural things come through in the clutch. And whether that's a flood or some incident or whatever, you see kind of what people are made of, and how they were trained, and how the company operates, because it does. I mean, it obviously flows through.
And I love that you picked an example that wasn't, I think naturally when people think security that don't have a lot of experience with industry, their mind goes to, someone was trying to break in or rob someone,
Right.
some
No.
issue of violence. And this just goes to show that, there are lots of examples of situations that crop up where you need someone dependable and reliable and trustworthy and cool in a crisis
Right.
that aren't necessarily malicious, right?
Right.
Just in the course of the events of life, you need to have that team in place, and then they can come in and really perform, and it makes everyone feel really good.
Yeah. I mean, security is, I think it's sometimes not properly defined as it relates to commercial
Yeah.
real estate. There's a lot of aspects to it that aren't considered. That's one of them. Situations like that. I mean, even like on a slip and fall or something, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
you have in a property. We've had it in a bunch of properties. And again, some of those cases were, fraud. Again, you had to have
Mhm.
an investigation associated with that. Some of it
Mhm.
was legitimate. People get hurt. It's so, just reacting to that kind of stuff. Um, yeah, unfortunately, we've seen, fraudulent slip and fall stuff in properties and
Oh, wow. And in
crazy.
those cases, is having a security witness helpful?
Sure. Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, of course. Because you can get a statement right away.
Hmm.
Well, you look at a camera, you can kind of piece it all together of
Hmm.
whether or not this is legit. And in this one case, we kind of saw this woman, she's clearly kind of taking a dive, and it was
Like she did it intent. She just,
right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
wow.
So, yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that these folks see and deal with, and they deal with a lot of unruly people too.
Hmm.
And they don't have patience, right? If you go into a building and you're waiting in line and they don't have patience, or they're late or something, and
Hmm.
so that makes the job even tougher. That's why I'm saying maybe if you can take that, I think that's a boiling point as it
Hmm.
relates to a lot of the security issues, or perception of outside security, is that interaction
Yep.
at the door. And it can be frustrating for people. And they carry that out of the building, obviously, and so the perception holds. But so that's why I'm thinking maybe if there's better systems or technology to get rid of or lessen that type of interface,
Hmm.
again, it'll be better for the owners, better for the visitors, probably better for the security company. If they can, because it doesn't seem like a good use of resources.
Sure. And sort of creating boiling points where you don't
Right.
need to.
We don't need it. Right.
That makes a lot of sense. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I feel like I'm looking at my notes. We've really covered the gamut today. It's such a pleasure chatting with you. Before, as we wrap up, is there anything we haven't touched on that you think is interesting that we want to throw out there, either about security or even just about the direction of real estate?
Well, I think one other thing I
Mhm.
wanted to add was, how does good security or perceived good security
Mhm.
affect a commercial property, and
Yes.
consequently its owner. Um, and there's just so many ways that it benefits. Again, hard to put it into an Excel spreadsheet and come out on the
Mhm.
other side saying, hey, if I invest X amount per year, it returns
Totally.
in 2.1 years. But I mean, just fundamentally, I mean, if you have first and foremost, people want to be at a workplace that feels safe, right? And
Absolutely.
if you don't, I mean, if you once you have that, it affects everybody, right? It helps your employee
Mhm.
retention. It helps your tenants' employee retention, right? It potentially leads to better rents, so better income. Um, and it just flows through the whole it flows through the whole system. You're not spending time and money reacting to events. And but again, I wish there was, I wish I was smart enough to figure out a way to quantify it, because we see it and it's obvious, but again, security is a discretionary thing. So it's tough.
Sure. Yeah.
Tough
It's a
for folks to justify it
soft
sometimes.
benefit, but the challenge is being able to sort of put a number on it.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously your insurance
Mm-hmm.
costs are affected favorably. But
Yeah. And if anything, I think I've seen it quantified most effectively through this sort of de-risking, right? Like what's the risk if you don't have this in place?
right.
And what is the liability? But so much interesting fodder to sort of think about, especially, I keep coming back to your point around broadening the scope of the role a little bit, and not being so, so quick to draw that box around what it is and what it isn't.
Yeah. Cause I don't know that it's working effectively or properly right now.
No, and that's,
there's a lot of different, I mean, I stroke this with a little bit of a broad brush.
Yep.
But, I mentioned the size of the commercial real estate market, but the types of properties within that market too, there's so many different requirements. Again, whether it's retail, apartments, office, storage, multifamily, industrial, hospitality, but that one issue, I think, is core to a lot of the I'd say problems, but issues that need to be addressed in security as it relates to commercial property.
Totally. And I think on a positive note, this is the time to innovate, right? We've chatted about the sort of AI wave that's hitting. Certainly it's something that my company Brav is jumping on. There are a lot of other innovators in the space. So, I'm excited to see how the next few years really transform this for the security industry and for the people working in it too, who I think are looking for a better experience.
Right. Well, again, if, just going back to my example in that mall I was in yesterday, where they have guards in there that sort of look sort of paramilitary, if you will, right? Is that what we need? Is that what we need? Is that the right thing? Is there whatever robots or AI powered robots that can fulfill some of that? I mean, I don't know. It's like I said, it's what's been done for the last number of decades, but not sure it's the right thing going forward. Totally. For the people for the owners or the people in the industry itself. So
agree with you there. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
To our audience, if you learned something, tell someone about the podcast. And Mark, thank you so much, and looking forward to staying in touch and maybe having you back on at some point.
I hope so. My pleasure, Anna. Thank you so much. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye
Take
now.
care. Bye-bye.
And that wraps up another episode of Security Download. Thank you for joining. For show notes and other episodes, visit us at securitydownload.live and be sure to follow on your favorite podcast app.